Hello, welcome to lesson number 6 in our series on Judaism, beliefs and teachings. This lesson is all about Abraham. You can see our objectives there are to understand who Abraham was and know the covenant that he made with God. And we're going to be thinking about understanding the impact of the covenant that he made with God today. Our need to know today is you need to know that all Jews consider themselves to be descendants of Abraham, and the covenant that he made with God still affects them today. Question to start with is, how do you measure a successful life? Maybe you want to pause the video there and have a think about that for yourself. But maybe you would consider a fantastic career the measure of a successful life. Perhaps the friends and the family that you have around you would be the measure of a successful life. Perhaps how many people attend your funeral and what they say about you at your funeral could be the measure of a successful life. In a newspaper, we read the obituaries. When someone dies, we read up about the impact that their life has had on the world. How do you measure a successful life? Well, in the time of Abraham, how successful you were was all about the legacy that you were going to leave. So it was all really about how many male children you had, how many sons you had who were going to carry on your family legacy, carry on your family name. This is important to consider when we think about Abraham. Abraham, I introduced you last lesson when we were talking about the Jewish relationship with God, because he made with God one of the key covenants that we're going to look at in a bit more detail today. But we're going to have a look at his life as well. Now, Abraham started off life as Abram, was his original name. No ha in it, just Abram. Abram means exalted father. And this was ironic, sadly ironic, because he didn't have any children, no sons or daughters. Now, in a couple of slides previously, we talked about what makes a successful life. Now, for Abram at the time, he was not living a successful life. He didn't have any children. He lived with his dad, and he was married as well to a lady called Sarai, whose name changes to Sarah later on. But at this point in time, no kids. Now, what was significant about him at the time was that he was a monotheist. We've looked at this word already, monotheism. He believed in one God in a culture where they believed in many gods. In fact, one day, the Jewish story goes that he smashed all of the gods, the kind of idols and small gods around his father's house. And his father was outraged by this and said, well, how dare you destroy these idols, destroy these gods? And Abraham said, in response, there is only one God. And you shouldn't put your trust and stand up for these gods who can't even stand up for themselves. They couldn't even protect themselves, from my hammer, from when I smashed them up. Why do you worship them if I can destroy them? Abraham was married to Sarah or Sarai at the time, and you can see here from the book of Genesis chapter 12, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, one of the reasons that Jews revere Abraham is because he was so obedient to God. And if you could imagine you being told by God today, or by someone, leave your family's household and move to a whole new land, a land you don't even know, but that's where you need to go, I think you might be apprehensive about that. I think all of us would be. But Abraham was obedient to God, and so left his father's household, left the land he lived in, and went to this new land that God told him to go to. Now, as I told you before, Abraham and Sarah had no children. But we can see there from this promise from God that he has promised them descendants. And time goes by and they age, they get really old, and they don't have any children. And at one point, Abraham's wife says, sleep with my servant, sleep with her, and we'll make some children that way. And so Abraham does, and they have a son who's called Ishmael. But this causes all sorts of problems, and in the household the relationship starts to break down, and eventually Abraham has to send Ishmael away, but God promises him that he'll be looked after. Eventually, and we're talking a long time after this, Abraham and Sarah, they have a child called Isaac, which means laughter. And God said, through Isaac the blessing's going to come. If we go to Genesis chapter 17 now, verses 6 to 10, you can see it there on the screen. I will make you very fruitful. This is God talking to Abraham. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant, is our word, as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, and for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Now, if we look back at what we know about covenant, covenant involves different things. It involves promises from God, promises from people, and then a physical sign to remind everyone of the covenant. So here's the covenant with Abraham. I've broken it down to make it as simplistic as possible. But effectively, God has promised Abraham descendants, and God's going to look after those descendants. That's that expression there. I'm going to be their God. They're going to be my people. He's going to look after his descendants. He's going to give them this land of Canaan. He's going to give them the promised land. He's going to bless the whole world through Abraham and his descendants. Let's look at the promise made by Abraham to God. Abraham promises that he will only worship one God. He's going to stay monotheistic and be obedient to him. And we've seen some of that obedience already. That obedience was there when he left that land and went to somewhere else. That obedience was there when he sent Ishmael away, trusting that God was going to look after him. And then a physical sign to seal the agreement, it would be circumcision for all males, removal of the foreskin of the penis on the 8th day, when the child is 8 days old. All right, let's check your understanding time. So pause the video, have a go at these questions, and we'll look at some answers when you unpause it. All right, so let's check your understanding. Let's look at some of the answers to these questions. Number one, what belief did Abraham hold on to even though his father didn't agree? That was belief in one God. Abraham was monotheistic. Number two, what did God ask Abraham to do? He asked Abraham to leave where he lived and go to a new land, a different land, the land of Canaan. Number three, God promised three things to Abraham. What were they? Promised him descendants that would be looked after by God. Promised him land. We talked about the promised land. And he promised him that him and his descendants would be a blessing, and that through the descendants of Abraham, the whole world would be blessed. What did Abraham promise on behalf of all his descendants? That they would be obedient to God. What is the physical sign of the covenant that Abraham made with God? Is circumcision. An extension there, how might Abraham's story influence Jews today? There's lots of different ways why this story might influence Jews today, but let's think firstly about faith and obedience. Abraham was incredibly faithful. He trusted in God. When God said, go to that land, Abraham went, even though he didn't know what the land was going to be like. When God said, send Ishmael away, he's going to be all right, I'll look after him. Abraham trusted in God and sent Ishmael away. Linked with this is the obedience that Abraham showed. God says do it, and Abraham does it, even when he doesn't know what the outcome is going to be. And these things might be hugely influential to Jews today. The 10 trials of Abraham. So we've mentioned a couple of these already, but some Jewish scholars talk about these different tests that Abraham had to go through. Here's our man again, Maimonides. He points out the 10 different trials of Abraham. So God tells Abraham to leave his homeland, to be a stranger. When he gets there, there's a famine in the land. The third trial, the Egyptians seize his wife and they take her to Pharaoh. The fourth trial, Abraham faces incredible odds in the battle of the 4 and 5 kings. He marries Hagar. We talked about Hagar as his wife's servant after not being able to have children with Sarah. God tells him to circumcise himself at an advanced age. That is a big trial. Number 7, the king, he captures Sarah and intends her to take her for himself. Another trial. God tells him to send Hagar away, Ishmael, after having a child with her. Number 9, his son Ishmael, we've spoken about him, he becomes estranged. And then number 10 is the toughest one, the final, the 10th trial of Abraham, is God tells him to sacrifice his dear son Isaac upon an altar. So here's an image there from the 10th trial of Abraham. God says, take your son, your beloved son whom you love, take him to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a hill that I will show you. And so Abraham goes to do that. And just before they're all ready to go, it's really interesting. He's walking up the hill with Isaac, and Isaac says, "Oh, Dad, effectively, we've got all the stuff here for a sacrifice, but I don't see a lamb, I don't see an animal." And Abraham turns to Isaac and says, "Well, don't you worry. God's going to provide. God will provide the lamb. God will provide the sacrifice." And when they get there to the top, Isaac he takes part. He gets down into position. And Abraham gets ready to sacrifice him, and then an angel of the Lord tells Abraham to stop, don't do that. And Abraham looks up and he sees a ram caught in a thicket in a bush, and sacrifices the ram instead. And this is the final test for Abraham, and through it God says, now I can see, I can trust you completely. You didn't even withhold your son from me. Now I can trust you like 100%. And God here learns that Isaac as well will be able to continue the covenant on, because Isaac didn't panic or run away. He kind of went through and was obedient to God as well. So there's an overview there of the covenant. And it's helpful to think about, especially for the GCSE, how this covenant affects Jews today. So as we said already, all Jews would consider themselves in some way or another descendants from Abraham. Many Jews choose to live in the promised land today. They live in Israel. It's called making Aliyah. When you choose to leave where you live and go and live in the promised land, just like Abraham did before. This idea of blessing the world, many Jews, they become doctors or teachers or other people who are going to have a really positive impact on the world around them, because they take that part of the covenant very seriously, that they're going to be a blessing to their communities and the world around them. If we look at the promise made by humankind, this idea of worshipping one God, staying strictly monotheistic and being obedient in all they do to him. We're going to look at the covenant with the God's commandments in the next lesson with Moses, but they would look to keep the commands as well as part of that obedience. And finally, their circumcision. All the males would be circumcised as part of following that commandment today. So last few questions today. We're going to pause the video there. 3 questions and an extension if you want it. Hit pause and we'll look at some answers in a minute. All right, let's check your understanding and see how you got on. Here are some answers for those questions. Number 6, why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? You could say that he was testing him. He was testing to see whether his faith was strong. Number 7, what can Jews learn what can Jews learn from the 10 trials of Abraham? They can learn today that to always be faithful and to always be obedient, even when life gets tough. You might say that they can learn to expect resistance in life, that even when they're going in the right direction, where God wants them to go, they still might come up across barriers, and they'll need to be faithful to God and obedient in getting through those barriers. How does the covenant with Abraham affect Jews today? Well, just very briefly on that one, you could say that they see themselves as descendants of Abraham. Some choose to live in the promised land, and so they make Aliyah and they go and live over there. Number 3, you could say they see it as their responsibility to be a blessing to the rest of the world. So they might get a job like being a doctor or a teacher or give money to charity, etc. And the males may choose to get circumcised as well as part of the covenant. Extension there, Abraham is a role model for all. You might have had to think outside the box a little bit on this one. On one side, you could say, yes, he is a great role model. You can see through the trials that he goes through that he's faithful and obedient to God, even when it's really difficult. Give some examples of those. On the other side, you might say he's only a role model if you are monotheistic and you want to follow in one God. If you were polytheistic, maybe you wouldn't see him as a role model. Obviously, there's the whole controversial part that he was open to sacrifice his son, and maybe for you feel that doesn't make him a good role model, that that's something that should never even enter your mind, even if you feel you're being obedient to God. I'll leave that one up to you to decide, but that's your opinion on that one. Okay, that brings us to the end of the lesson today. Let's just relook for the last time at our need to know. All Jews consider themselves as descendants of Abraham. The covenant that he made with God still affects Jews today. Can you explain that sentence? Could you give me more detail about how it affects Jews today? Keep reminding yourself of the key words, guys. Remind yourself what a covenant is, what does monotheistic mean, etc. Looking forward to seeing you next lesson, where we can look at the life of Moses and the covenant that he made with God.